Fake HOA cop tried to arrest me for unpaid dues. I handed him my federal judge ID. It was supposed to be a regular Saturday morning. Coffee in hand, slippers on, and peace in the neighborhood, or so I thought. That peace shattered the moment a man in a cheap security outfit strutted up to my porch, flashing a plastic badge and barking about unpaid dues. Little did he know he had just picked the wrong house and the wrong person to mess with. You see, I'm not just a homeowner, I'm a federal judge. And what followed? Let's just say this fake HOA cop was about to get the courtroom experience of his life, right on my lawn. It was a quiet Saturday morning, one of those rare days when everything just feels still. The sun had barely risen, and I had just stepped out onto my porch with a fresh cup of coffee. The birds were chirping, a light breeze was dancing through the trees, and for a moment, everything felt perfectly normal. My neighborhood, tucked away in a quiet suburb, was usually uneventful, the kind of place where the most dramatic thing you'd hear about was someone's lawn getting a little too long. That was the rhythm of life here. Peaceful, predictable, and drama-free. I had just settled into my favorite chair when I noticed someone walking up the driveway. It wasn't a neighbor, that much was clear. This man was dressed in what looked like an off-brand security guard uniform. Black cargo pants, a navy polo with the words HOA Patrol embroidered in white across the chest, and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He walked with an odd kind of confidence, like someone who had practiced authority but hadn't quite mastered it. Something about him immediately felt off. He didn't knock. Instead, he stood at the bottom of the porch steps and called out loudly, "You the owner of this property?" I nodded cautiously, not really sure what this was about. He didn't introduce himself, didn't offer a greeting, just launched straight into a statement that made me almost spit out my coffee. "You're delinquent on your HOA dues," he said, pulling out what looked like a clipboard. 3 months behind. That's a violation, and I'm here to collect, or take appropriate enforcement action. At first, I thought it was some kind of joke, a hidden camera prank or a weird sales pitch. But the man's face was deadly serious. He flipped the clipboard around and showed me a printed violation notice that looked like it had been made on Microsoft Word. My name was spelled wrong, the address had a typo, and there wasn't even an official letterhead. I scanned it quickly, noting grammatical errors and fake-sounding legal terms like immediate arrest authority granted by Neighborhood Statute Clause 4. I looked up at him and asked who had sent him. He replied flatly, "The HOA board." Now, I've lived in this neighborhood for nearly 10 years. I've been to the meetings. I know the HOA board members by name, and none of them had ever mentioned anything about unpaid dues, let alone enforcement officers. When I asked for names or identification, he got defensive. "You don't need their names. I'm authorized to act on their behalf. Now, unless you want this to escalate, I suggest you cooperate." The absurdity of it all started to hit me. The uniform looked like something you could buy online, the badge clipped to his belt was plastic and bore a generic eagle emblem, and the entire operation felt improvised. Still, the man stood there with his chest puffed out like he expected me to cave. He pointed to his clipboard again, claiming that failure to comply would result in civil apprehension under local association law. I almost laughed, but something in his tone told me he was serious, at least in his own mind. I asked for documentation, proof of dues owed, signed statements, even a copy of the supposed bylaws he was quoting. He waved me off, saying, "We don't have time for that. Either you pay now or I take action." I raised an eyebrow, wondering what kind of action he meant. Was he actually threatening to arrest me on my own porch over fake HOA dues? It was so bizarre it almost didn't feel real. That's when he stepped closer, like he was trying to intimidate me. He told me I was officially detained until payment was made. At that point, I knew this was more than a misunderstanding. This man believed he had the power to enforce something, anything, and I wasn't about to play along. I stayed calm. Not because I wasn't angry, but because I knew exactly how this would go if I let it escalate on his terms. He was standing just a few feet away now, still talking, still trying to assert control. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the twitch in his jaw. He wasn't just role-playing. He actually thought he was in charge. My mind was racing through the legal implications of impersonating an officer, making false claims, and threatening unlawful detainment. He had no idea who he was talking to. Standing there on my porch, I kept my eyes fixed on him as he continued his act, completely immersed in the persona he had created for himself. The uniform was just convincing enough to make a passing glance think twice, but the more I looked at it, the more ridiculous it seemed. The HOA patrol patch was stitched on crooked, and the fabric of his polo shirt was already beginning to pill around the collar. His cargo pants looked like they belonged to a paint contractor, and his scuffed boots had definitely seen more hardware stores than patrol beats. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a shiny badge attached to a leather wallet. He flipped it open like he'd practiced it 100 times in front of a mirror. The badge was gold-colored, vaguely resembling a law enforcement emblem, but on closer inspection, it read Neighborhood Enforcement Authority Security Division. No state seal, no department name, not even a badge number. Just a vague symbol of authority made to fool the inattentive. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so unsettling. "I'm fully deputized by the HOA board to enforce compliance," he said, his voice firm but shaky underneath the bravado. "You've violated several community standards, including unpaid dues, unapproved modifications to your exterior lighting, and failure to respond to certified HOA notices." I almost wanted to ask if he was reading off a script. His words felt rehearsed, his tone overly formal, as if he were mimicking courtroom drama instead of speaking from knowledge or authority. I challenged him, asking for identification, a board contact, or even a written enforcement policy. He dodged the questions, instead pointing again to the fake citation on his clipboard. "These aren't suggestions," he warned. "You are now in non-compliance status, and further refusal to act will lead to serious consequences, including civil penalties and possible detainment." I stared at him, realizing just how deep into this role he had gone. He was trying to escalate the situation, hoping I'd panic or make a mistake. Maybe even try to physically push him off my property, giving him an excuse to call the real police and spin some false narrative. His posture was rigid, back straight, chest puffed out like a mall cop about to make his first big bust. But behind all that bluff, I could see the nervousness creeping in. He kept glancing at his clipboard, as if double-checking that his imaginary laws and codes were still there. He wasn't used to being questioned. He was used to intimidating people into complying, or at the very least, confusing them long enough to get them to hand over a check. But I didn't budge. I asked him how long he'd worked for the HOA. He said, "I'm a contract enforcer, third party. They bring me in when things get out of hand." When I asked for a company name, he hesitated, then mumbled something like, "Neighborhood Asset Control." I repeated it back to him slowly, and he nodded, clearly hoping I wouldn't look it up or ask more questions. I'd never heard of such a company, and I'm certain no one on our HOA board would hire an outsider to handle something as delicate as dues collection, especially not someone dressed like a weekend security trainee. He must have sensed that his routine wasn't working on me, because he started to raise his voice. "You think this is a joke? You think just because you've got a nice house you can ignore the rules everyone else has to follow?" His face flushed with frustration. He stepped forward again, this time pulling a phone out of his pocket. "I'll call it in. Don't test me." I asked who exactly he planned to call, and he quickly answered, "My dispatch. We've got a system." There was no dispatch. There was no system. There wasn't even a real HOA complaint. This was all theater, bad theater. But what made it dangerous was that he didn't seem to know where the line was between his performance and reality. People like this, who get a taste of fake power and decide to wear it like a crown, are unpredictable. It's one thing to play dress up, but it's another to step onto someone's property and threaten them with legal consequences you made up the night before. His threats became more frantic. He pointed to my driveway, claiming that my vehicle registration had expired, and that he had authority to report and flag it for immobilization. I glanced at my truck. It had a brand new registration sticker, clearly visible. He didn't care. He was pulling anything he could out of thin air, hoping I'd give in to his fake authority before I called his bluff. The strange thing was how much effort he was putting into this. He wasn't just pretending. He believed in the character he had created. The badge, the clipboard, the warnings, the escalating tone. It wasn't about HOA dues anymore. It was about control. I stood there quietly for a few seconds, watching him as he continued his strange, desperate performance. His chest was heaving slightly now, his hands twitching just enough to betray the panic under his self-righteous facade. He was clearly not expecting resistance, at least not from someone who remained calm, analytical, and utterly unimpressed by his theatrics. But I had dealt with far worse characters in courtrooms and depositions. If he thought he could intimidate me with a plastic badge and a clipboard full of made-up rules, he was playing a very dangerous game with the wrong opponent. He started pacing on the edge of the porch like he was sizing up the situation, occasionally glancing around as if someone might be watching or recording. He barked another empty warning about non-compliance and association repercussions, and I could tell his confidence was starting to falter. His eyes weren't steady anymore. He was searching, maybe for a reaction, maybe for an escape route if this all went sideways. The thing about people who wear fake authority is that their power only exists if others believe in it. And once you stop believing, the illusion crumbles fast. Then he took things up a notch. Without asking permission, he stepped onto my porch and stood a few feet from me, holding up his phone like it was some kind of enforcement device. "This is being recorded," he said with forced calm, "for documentation and legal review." I nodded slowly, unfazed. I gestured to the Ring camera above my door and said, "Good. Mine too." That flicker of uncertainty crossed his face again, but he tried to recover by scrolling dramatically on his phone screen. "You're about 5 minutes away from having a citation issued, and once that happens, you'll be in violation Tier 3, he announced, pretending to read from some enforcement protocol. "That means an automatic fine, potential vehicle tow, and, if necessary, physical detainment until compliance is confirmed." It was comical how specific yet utterly fabricated his warnings were. And yet, he kept going, adding layers to his fantasy of power, probably hoping he could bluff his way through. I didn't speak for a while. I just sipped my coffee, letting the silence stretch. And that silence, I realized, was making him nervous. He wanted me to shout, to argue, to make a mistake that would give him a sense of control. But I knew better. I knew the law. I knew my rights. And more importantly, I knew exactly who I was, and he didn't. That's when I reached into my back pocket slowly and pulled out my leather wallet. I opened it, flipped through a couple of cards, and paused deliberately. His eyes tracked every movement. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. I could see his expression shifting. He thought I was going for a credit card or cash, maybe even a checkbook to settle this debt, quickly and quietly. He thought his pressure had finally worked. His body language relaxed slightly, like he had won. He even leaned forward a little, as if to accept whatever form of submission he thought was coming. But instead of money, I pulled out a small, official-looking card, plain white, with gold trim and a seal embossed into the surface. It wasn't flashy, but it had a weight to it. The kind of identification that spoke volumes without needing big words. I held it up slowly, letting him read it at his own pace. His eyes scanned the card, then snapped up to meet mine. He didn't speak. Not right away. I could tell the words were caught somewhere in his throat, like they didn't know whether to run or beg. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. The badge clipped to his belt suddenly looked even more ridiculous than before. His clipboard hung limply at his side, forgotten for the moment. He blinked a few times, visibly trying to process what he was seeing. He took a small step back, then another, and for the first time since he arrived, he looked completely lost. There was no more bravado in his posture, no more sharp commands or threats. He didn't even try to justify himself. He just stood there, caught between disbelief and dread, because right there in my hand was my official federal judge ID. A title that didn't need explanation, a position that made his entire charade not just pathetic but potentially criminal. He realized, in that moment, exactly how badly he had miscalculated the situation. He stood frozen, eyes glued to the ID card I held up like it had the power to erase every ounce of false authority he had tried to wield. His mouth parted slightly as if he was about to speak, but no words came out. I could see the gears turning in his head, the dawning horror creeping slowly into his expression. This wasn't just someone with a bit of legal knowledge or a homeowner who happened to know their rights. He had walked up to the doorstep of a sitting federal judge, barking out imaginary laws and threatening illegal detainment. And now that truth was staring him directly in the face. His hands, which had moments earlier been animated and assertive, dropped to his sides. His phone lowered slowly, no longer pretending to record anything. His shoulders sagged just a little, the way a child's might when caught red-handed in a lie that went too far. But even then, I could see the conflict in his face. Part of him still wanted to salvage whatever authority he thought he had. The other part, the part governed by the sudden and crushing realization of who I really was scrambling to figure out just how bad this mistake might cost him. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The ID spoke louder than any rebuke could. It wasn't just a card, it was a symbol of real authority, the kind that was backed by the United States government and all the weight of federal law. And the contrast between that and his dollar store badge could not have been more humiliating. He blinked several times, then gave a dry swallow, his throat clearly tight with the pressure building inside him. I didn't know, he finally muttered, voice suddenly quieter, devoid of the arrogance it carried just minutes ago. No one told me who you were. He tried to smile, but it came out as a nervous twitch. His hand half lifted, as if unsure whether to shake mine, apologize, or reach for his fake badge and rip it off. I said nothing, still holding the ID at chest level, giving him all the time he needed to stew in the magnitude of what he had done. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, eyes darting around now, not with authority, but with nervousness. His confidence had cracked, and from the look in his eyes, he was now wondering if he had just crossed the line into something far more serious than a bluff gone wrong. His whole plan, whatever scam or self-appointed mission he thought he was fulfilling, was unraveling faster than he could react. He cleared his throat and tried again. Look, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was just doing what the HOA told me to do. They sent me out, gave me a list of violations, and I raised my hand slightly, not to silence him, but to pause him. He stopped mid-sentence. He could tell by now that I wasn't going to entertain the excuses. Whether someone else had truly sent him or whether he had appointed himself as neighborhood lawman didn't matter anymore. The damage was done, and the weight of it was finally settling onto his shoulders. His eyes flicked back to the ID once more, then to my face, then to the porch, as if he might find some magical way to walk away from all of this without consequence. Maybe we can. If we just forget this happened, no harm done, right? He said, trying to shift into some twisted version of diplomacy. His voice was shaky, the kind of tone someone uses when they realize they've been bluffing in a high-stakes game and the other player just laid down a royal flush. I could see the sweat starting to bead at his hairline. It wasn't hot outside. His nervous system had simply kicked into overdrive. He took a slow step backward, his feet now moving with careful calculation instead of arrogant purpose. He knew he was in over his head, and retreat felt like the only viable option. But even as he began to shift toward damage control, the panic lingered in his posture, in the darting of his eyes, in the tremble beneath every word he spoke. Then came the shift, the subtle, desperate attempt to rewrite what had just happened. Maybe I didn't say it right earlier, he stammered. I wasn't threatening you, sir. I was just trying to explain the community policies. I wasn't going to actually detain anyone. The spin was clumsy, too little, too late. He had spent the past 10 minutes declaring his supposed authority, making veiled threats, and quoting imaginary statutes, and now he wanted to walk it back like none of it had ever happened. The moment I revealed my federal judge ID, the transformation in his demeanor was almost immediate, like a switch had been flipped. Gone was the swagger, the arrogant stance, the barking commands. What replaced it was a man visibly unraveling, his fake authority crumbling under the weight of real power. His hands, once gesturing wildly and confidently, now hovered awkwardly by his sides, unsure whether to reach for his clipboard again or stuff themselves in his pockets out of sheer discomfort. His eyes no longer held the challenge they did before. They now avoided mine entirely, flicking to the ground, to his shoes, to anything that wasn't the truth standing directly in front of him. He took a slow, shaky step back and tried to laugh, an unconvincing chuckle that died in his throat before it could even become a full sound. Wow, okay, he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Didn't realize I was talking to a federal judge. His voice cracked a little. The tone had shifted from combative to apologetic, coated with a layer of desperation that was impossible to miss. It was clear now that he wasn't just embarrassed, he was afraid. I watched as he tried to recalibrate his approach in real time. It was like watching a terrible actor try to switch genres mid-performance, fumbling from thriller to comedy and failing miserably at both. Listen, I think there's just been some confusion here, he said, his words coming faster now, almost stumbling over themselves. I wasn't trying to be aggressive or anything, just, following protocol. The irony of him suddenly trying to sound reasonable would have been amusing if the situation weren't so absurd. He had come onto my property, tried to assert legal authority he didn't have, and threatened detainment over a made-up set of violations. Now, faced with the undeniable reality that he had picked a fight with someone who actually had the power to end his little game for good, he was scrambling to make it all disappear with vague apologies and nervous smiles. He held up his clipboard again, but this time like a peace offering instead of a weapon. Look, these are just notes from the HOA, he mumbled, flipping through the pages quickly, as if trying to convince even himself that something in there was legitimate. I didn't create any of this, okay? I was just told to come out and make contact with non-compliant homeowners. The way he said it made it sound rehearsed, like he'd used that excuse before, maybe even successfully in the past with other neighbors who didn't know better. But the clipboard now looked more pathetic than threatening. Sloppy printouts, handwritten notes in the margins, and even a doodle of what looked like a dog in the corner of one page. There was nothing official about it. He kept flipping pages, babbling about compliance lists, neighborhood bylaws, and enforcement procedures. But his words were losing structure. His sentences grew shorter, more fragmented, and filled with qualifiers like maybe, possibly, and I think. And then came the backpedaling and all-out verbal retreat. Honestly, I didn't mean to make it sound like a legal threat, he said. It's just how they told me to phrase things so people would take it seriously. I mean, I didn't expect you to be a judge or anything. If I had known, I obviously would have approached things differently. That line alone said everything. It wasn't that what he was doing was wrong. It was that he had chosen the wrong person to try it on. That was his real mistake in his eyes. Not impersonating a legal authority, not issuing fake citations, not trespassing, but getting caught by someone who could actually hold him accountable. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I let the silence hang in the air, heavy and deliberate. He filled it with more apologies, more excuses, more attempts to rewrite the encounter. I was just doing what I thought was my job, he repeated. I mean, they gave me the list, the badge, the clipboard. I figured it was legit. I didn't mean to overstep. His voice was getting softer now, like he was running out of steam. He looked exhausted, not just from the confrontation, but from the mental acrobatics of trying to keep his story straight. He was unraveling right there in front of me, and the more he talked, the more obvious it became that this wasn't the first time he had pulled something like this. It might have worked elsewhere, with people too confused or intimidated to push back. But not this time. Not with me. And still, he tried to salvage whatever shred of dignity he had left. Maybe we can just chalk this up to a misunderstanding, he offered, his voice barely above a whisper now. No harm done, right? HOA 6.